Elena Rodriguez wiped the marble countertop for the third time that morning, her calloused hands moving in practice circles across the pristine surface. The kitchen of the Blackwell mansion was larger than most people's entire homes, with gleaming copper pots hanging from wrought iron hooks and windows that overlooked manicured gardens stretching toward the Pacific Ocean. At 28, Elena had been cleaning these same surfaces for nearly 4 years, invisible to the family that owned this fortress of wealth perched high in the hills of Malibu. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning routine never varied. Elena arrived at dawn, entering through the service entrance with her worn canvas bag containing rubber gloves, her lunch wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, and the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond these walls. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, dusting, polishing, and maintaining the opulent lifestyle of the Blackwell family, while remaining careful never to disturb the delicate ecosystem of privilege that surrounded her. Victoria Blackwell, the lady of the house, barely acknowledged Elena's existence beyond leaving passive-aggressive notes about invisible smudges on bathroom mirrors or demanding that the fresh flowers in the foyer be replaced daily. The patriarch, Richard Blackwell, was different entirely. At 55, he had built his fortune through ruthless real estate acquisitions and technology investments, crushing smaller companies beneath his empire while displaying his wealth like a peacock showing its feathers. Where Victoria was cold but predictable, Richard was calculating and cruel, taking particular pleasure in reminding the household staff of their place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. Elena understood her position perfectly. She was hired help, brought in to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection that wealth required. Her own story remained locked away, buried beneath years of necessity and survival. Few people knew that she had once sat at a baby grand piano in a conservatory in Mexico City, her fingers dancing across keys with the precision of someone born to create music. Fewer still knew that she had been accepted to study at the prestigious Berklee College of Music in Boston, her acceptance letter arriving the same week her father's construction business collapsed and her younger sister Maria was diagnosed with leukemia. The choice had been simple then, though it felt like dying. Elena could pursue her dreams and watch her family lose their home and her sister lose her chance at treatment, or she could sacrifice her future to become the anchor that held them together. She chose family, as she always had, as she always would. The piano lessons stopped. The conservatory dreams were folded away like childhood clothes that no longer fit. Elena learned English, applied for a visa, and made her way north to Los Angeles, where wealthy families needed invisible hands to maintain their visible success. Now, 4 years later, her fingers moved across cleaning supplies instead of piano keys. Her sister Maria was in remission, attending university in Guadalajara on a scholarship Elena's monthly wire transfers had helped make possible. Her parents had managed to keep their small house, though her father's construction work remained sporadic. Every dollar Elena earned disappeared into family obligations, leaving her with just enough to rent a tiny studio apartment in East LA and buy groceries for one. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days surrounded by luxury while living in poverty. The Blackwell mansion contained 3 separate pianos. There was the concert grand in the formal living room that no one ever played, positioned perfectly for admiring but never touched. The upright piano in the morning room served as an expensive surface for displaying crystal vases and family photographs. Most painful of all was the gorgeous Steinway baby grand in Richard's private study, an instrument worth more than Elena would earn in 5 years, used primarily to hold his collection of expensive whiskey bottles. Elena had developed the discipline of not looking at the pianos directly. She cleaned around them, dusted their surfaces, and polished their wood until it gleamed, but she never allowed her fingers to touch the keys. She had learned that some doors, once closed, must remain that way to avoid the pain of remembering what lay beyond them. The Blackwell family treated their staff with the casual indifference of people who had never questioned their right to be served. They left messes with the confidence that someone else would clean them, spoke about their employees in third person while those same employees stood in the room, and displayed their wealth through parties and gatherings that showcased their status to other members of their exclusive social circle. Elena had worked dozens of these events over the years, serving canapés to guests who looked through her as if she were part of the furniture, cleaning up after parties where a single bottle of wine cost more than her monthly rent, watching from the periphery as the wealthy celebrated their good fortune while she counted the hours until her shift ended and she could return to her real life in the shadows of their abundance. This particular morning felt different, though Elena couldn't immediately identify why. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the mansion's corridors. Richard had been making phone calls all week, his voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction he reserved for moments when he was particularly pleased with his own cleverness. Victoria had been fluttering around the house like an anxious bird, micromanaging details of an upcoming event with an intensity that suggested something more significant than their usual dinner parties. Elena learned the details gradually, picking up fragments of conversation as she moved through her duties. The Blackwells were hosting their annual charity gala, an event that brought together the most influential people in Los Angeles to raise money for causes they could easily afford to support without the theatrical spectacle of a formal fundraiser. The guest list included tech moguls, entertainment industry executives, political figures, and old money families, whose wealth stretched back generations. This year's gala was particularly important to Richard because he was being honored for his philanthropic contributions, a recognition that would cement his social standing among the city's elite. The irony of Richard Blackwell receiving an award for charity wasn't lost on Elena, who had witnessed firsthand his treatment of the people who actually worked to maintain his lifestyle. She had seen him reduce staff members to tears over minor infractions, dock pay for perceived slowness, and fire long-term employees without severance for the crime of aging or showing signs of illness. But Richard understood the game of wealth. He knew that generous public donations were the price of admission to the highest levels of society, and he paid that price calculatedly, ensuring his charitable giving was highly visible and strategically positioned to maximize his social and business benefits. The gala would be the culmination of months of planning, a showcase designed to display not just his generosity, but his taste, his connections, and his power. Elena's role in this event was clearly defined. She would work behind the scenes, invisible and efficient, ensuring that the evening flowed seamlessly for the guests while remaining unseen herself. She would serve food, clear dishes, and clean up the aftermath, performing the labor that allowed the wealthy to enjoy their evening without being reminded of the work required to create such experiences. The preparations intensified as the date approached. Florists arrived daily with elaborate arrangements. Caterers tested menus and practiced presentation. A small army of temporary staff was hired to supplement the regular household employees. Elena found herself working longer hours, staying late to help prepare the mansion for what Richard insisted would be the social event of the season. 3 days before the gala, Elena was cleaning the main ballroom when she overheard a conversation that made her stop moving entirely. Richard was on the phone with someone, his voice carrying the particular tone of cruel amusement that Elena had learned to associate with his worst impulses. No, you don't understand," Richard was saying. "This isn't about the entertainment budget, this is about sending a message. These people need to understand their place, and sometimes the best way to do that is to put them in situations where their limitations become obvious to everyone." Elena continued dusting, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention while straining to hear more of the conversation. "Trust me," Richard continued, "the guests will love it. Nothing appeals to wealthy people more than watching someone embarrass themselves while pretending it's for their entertainment. It's like watching a car accident, but with the added pleasure of feeling superior about it." The conversation ended, and Richard walked away, leaving Elena with a cold feeling in her stomach. She had learned to recognize the signs when Richard was planning something particularly unpleasant for the staff. His charity gala, she realized, was going to involve more than just silent auctions and speeches about giving back to the community. The next day, Elena discovered exactly what Richard had in mind. She was called into his study, a room she rarely entered except to clean. Richard sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the Steinway Baby Grand visible in the corner, surrounded by crystal decanters filled with amber liquid that caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Elena," Richard said, not looking up from the papers he was reviewing, "I have a special assignment for you for Saturday's gala." Elena stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for instructions. In 4 years of working for the Blackwells, she had learned that the safest response to Richard's special assignments was silent compliance. "We're going to have entertainment during the dinner portion of the evening," Richard continued, finally looking up at her with the cold blue eyes that never seemed to hold any warmth. "Music, specifically, piano music." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest, though she couldn't yet articulate why this announcement filled her with dread. "Now, normally we would hire a professional pianist for such an event," Richard said, standing up and walking around his desk to lean against it casually. "Someone with proper training and experience. But I've had a much more interesting idea." He paused, watching Elena's face carefully, as if he were studying her reaction for signs of weakness or fear. "I've decided that our entertainment will come from within our own household staff, specifically from you, Elena. You're going to play piano for our guests." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken slightly, though she managed to remain standing. "Mr. Blackwell, I don't understand. I'm not a pianist. I'm a housekeeper." Richard's smile was sharp and cold.
"Oh, but Elena, I think you're being modest. You see, I make it my business to know things about the people who work in my home. Background checks, employment histories, educational records, very thorough research." Elena's heart began racing. She had been careful on her job application, mentioning only her cleaning experience and language skills. She had never discussed her musical background with anyone in the household. "Imagine my surprise," Richard continued, "when I discovered that my humble housekeeper had once studied at the Mexico City Conservatory. Piano performance, wasn't it? Quite impressive for someone who now makes her living with cleaning supplies and rubber gloves." Elena felt exposed, as if Richard had stripped away the protective layer of invisibility she had carefully constructed around herself. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Blackwell. I haven't played seriously in years." "Nonsense," Richard said, waving away her protest. "Music is like riding a bicycle, isn't it? Once you learn, you never really forget. And besides, our guests will be fascinated to discover that their evening's entertainment comes from such an unexpected source." Elena understood now why Richard's voice had carried that tone of cruel satisfaction during his phone conversation. This wasn't about providing good entertainment for his guests. This was about humiliating her, about putting her in a situation where she would fail publicly and provide amusement for people who already looked down on her. "I really don't think I can do this, Mr. Blackwell," Elena said quietly. "I would need time to prepare, to practice. I don't have access to a piano, and I haven't played in front of people in years." Richard gestured toward the Steinway in the corner of his study. "Problem solved. You can practice here during your off hours, of course. I wouldn't want your preparation to interfere with your regular duties." Elena stared at the beautiful instrument that she had been polishing for years without ever touching its keys. The idea of finally playing it should have filled her with joy, but instead she felt only terror. She knew what Richard was doing. He was setting her up to fail in front of his wealthy friends, turning her former dreams into a source of public humiliation. "The gala is in 3 days," Richard continued. "That should be plenty of time for someone with your background to prepare a suitable performance. Something classical, I think. Chopin, perhaps, or Debussy."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our guests appreciate sophisticated music. Elena felt trapped. If she refused, Richard would almost certainly fire her, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. Her family depended on the money she sent home, and jobs that paid well enough to support 2 households were rare for someone without legal documentation or professional credentials in the United States. But if she agreed and failed, the humiliation would be devastating. More than that, she would be exposing the most vulnerable part of herself to people who saw her as nothing more than hired help, turning her deepest passion into a source of entertainment for those who had never had to sacrifice anything for family. "I understand, Mr. Blackwell," Elena said finally, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. "Excellent," Richard said, returning to his desk. "The performance will be during the second course, around 8:30. Plan for about 15 minutes of music, something that will impress our guests and show them the caliber of talent we have right here in our own home." Elena left Richard's study feeling like she was walking through a nightmare. In 3 days, she would have to sit at a piano in front of hundreds of wealthy strangers and attempt to play music she hadn't touched in years, knowing that Richard was hoping she would fail and provide his guests with the cruel entertainment of watching someone embarrass themselves. That evening, after finishing her regular duties and ensuring the mansion was spotless for the next day's preparations, Elena stood alone in Richard's study staring at the Steinway baby grand. The room was dark except for the light from a single lamp, and the piano seemed to glow in the shadows like something magical and forbidden. She approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the fallboard covering the keys. The black and white keys gleamed in the lamplight, perfectly maintained and beautifully tuned, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that represented everything she had once dreamed of having in her life. Elena sat down on the bench and placed her hands over the keys without touching them. She could feel the weight of 4 years of silence, 4 years of suppressed music, 4 years of dreams deferred for survival. Her fingers remembered the shape of chords, the feeling of scales, the muscle memory of countless hours of practice from her youth. Slowly, carefully, she pressed down on middle C. The note rang out clear and pure in the quiet room, a sound that seemed to unlock something in Elena's chest that had been tightly closed for years. She played a simple C major scale, her fingers stumbling slightly over the pattern that had once been as natural as breathing. The sound of real piano keys under her fingers, the resonance of a properly tuned instrument, the physical sensation of creating music again, it all came flooding back to her with an intensity that made her eyes fill with tears. She had forgotten how much she had lost when she gave up music. She had forgotten the part of herself that lived only when she was playing, but the joy was mixed with terror. In 3 days, she would have to perform for people who expected perfection, people who would see any mistake as confirmation of their assumptions about her capabilities and her place in their world. She was out of practice, out of confidence, and completely out of her depth. Elena spent the next hour playing simple exercises and pieces she remembered from her conservatory days. Her fingers were stiff and her timing was off, but gradually the music began to return to her. Not the polished technique she had once possessed, but something raw and emotional that came from years of stored-up feeling finally finding expression. When she finally closed the piano and prepared to leave, Elena realized that regardless of Richard's cruel intentions, he had inadvertently given her something she hadn't known she was desperate to have back. For the first time in 4 years, she had made music again. Whatever happened at the gala, she would have these few days of rediscovering the part of herself she thought was lost forever. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and terror. Elena practiced every moment she could steal, staying late at the mansion to work on pieces she remembered loving, trying to rebuild skills that had atrophied during her years of silence. Her fingers grew stronger and more nimble with each session, and slowly the music began to sound like music again instead of the fumbling attempts of someone trying to remember a forgotten language. But she was also acutely aware that 3 days of practice could not undo 4 years of absence from serious playing. Professional pianists practiced for hours every day to maintain their skills, and Elena was attempting to prepare for a performance that would determine not just her employment but her dignity, with access to a piano only during stolen moments when the family was away or asleep. She chose her pieces carefully, selecting music that was beautiful but not technically demanding, pieces that would allow her to focus on expression rather than virtuosic display. A nocturne by Chopin that she had once performed in a student recital, a gentle piece by Debussy that emphasized melody over complex fingerwork, music that she could play with sincerity even if she couldn't play it with perfection. The day of the gala arrived with all the chaos that Elena had come to expect from Blackwell family events. Florists, caterers, and temporary staff filled the mansion from dawn until afternoon, transforming the already opulent space into something that looked like a movie set designed to showcase impossible wealth. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they blazed with light. Flowers were arranged in displays that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Tables were set with china and silverware that represented generations of accumulated luxury. Elena worked through it all, cleaning and preparing and trying not to think about the evening ahead. She had requested permission to leave early to prepare for her performance, a request that Richard had granted with the same cold smile he wore whenever he was anticipating someone else's discomfort. At 5 o'clock, Elena stood in her small apartment staring at the one dress she owned that could possibly be appropriate for the evening. It was a simple black dress she had bought from a thrift store for church services, modest and clean but obviously inexpensive. Next to the designer gowns that would fill the Blackwell ballroom, it would mark her immediately as someone who didn't belong. But Elena had learned long ago that dignity came from within rather than from external trappings. She dressed carefully, styled her hair as elegantly as she could manage, and looked at herself in the small mirror above her bathroom sink. The woman looking back at her was nervous but determined, someone who had been knocked down by life but had never stopped getting back up. She returned to the mansion as the first guests were arriving, slipping in through the service entrance to avoid the stream of luxury cars depositing their expensively dressed passengers at the front door. The house buzzed with activity as the carefully choreographed evening began, servers circulating with champagne and appetizers while guests admired the decorations and renewed acquaintances with others from their exclusive social circle. Elena watched from the kitchen as the evening unfolded, seeing familiar faces from newspapers and magazines, recognizing politicians and business leaders and entertainment industry executives. These were people who shaped policy and culture, who made decisions that affected millions of lives, who lived in a world so removed from ordinary experience that they might as well have been a different species. At 8 o'clock, guests were called to dinner in the main ballroom, where tables had been arranged around a small stage that had been constructed for the evening's entertainment. Elena could see the grand piano that had been moved from the formal living room, positioned under lights that would ensure her performance was visible to every person in the room. Richard stood to welcome his guests, his voice carrying easily through the room as he thanked them for their support of the evening's charitable cause and their friendship over the years. He spoke about the importance of giving back to the community, about the responsibility of those who had been blessed with success to help those who were still struggling. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Elena, who stood in the service corridor listening to him praise generosity while planning to humiliate someone who cleaned his house for survival wages. Before we continue with our dinner, Richard announced, "I have a special surprise for you tonight. We often talk about discovering talent in unexpected places, about recognizing potential where others might see only ordinary circumstances." Elena felt her heart begin racing as she realized her moment was approaching. "Tonight," Richard continued, "our entertainment comes from someone who has been part of our household for several years, someone whose background includes classical training that she has kept modestly hidden until now.
Please join me in welcoming Elena Rodriguez, who will be performing selections from the classical piano repertoire. The applause was polite but puzzled, as guests tried to understand who Elena was and why she was performing instead of a professional musician. Elena took a deep breath, smoothed her simple black dress, and walked toward the stage, knowing that the next 15 minutes would either destroy her or transform her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she approached the piano, Elena could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, assessing her appearance, her dress, her obvious status as someone who didn't belong in their world. She sat down at the bench and adjusted its height, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to place them on the keys. In the audience, she could see Richard watching her with anticipation, clearly expecting her to fail and provide his guests with the entertainment of witnessing someone embarrass themselves. She could see Victoria Blackwell looking confused and slightly disapproving, as if Elena's presence on the stage was somehow inappropriate. But she could also see other faces in the crowd, people who looked curious rather than judgmental, who seemed genuinely interested in what she might offer them. And in that moment, Elena realized that this performance wasn't really about Richard's cruel expectations or the guests' potential reactions. This was about the music itself, about the part of herself she had rediscovered during these past few days of practice, about the dreams that had never really died but had simply been waiting for an opportunity to breathe again. Elena placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Elena's fingers touched the keys with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend after years of separation. The first note she played was soft, almost hesitant, a gentle testing of the waters that would either carry her to safety or drown her in front of these powerful strangers. She had chosen to begin with Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that had always spoken to her soul with its flowing melodies and impressionistic beauty. The opening measures emerged from the piano like moonlight breaking through clouds, delicate and ethereal. Elena felt her breathing steady as the familiar patterns returned to her fingers, muscle memory awakening from its long sleep. The nervousness that had threatened to overwhelm her began to transform into something else, something that felt like coming home after a long journey in foreign lands. In the ballroom, conversations gradually died away as guests realized something unexpected was happening. This wasn't the background music they had anticipated during their dinner service. This was something that demanded attention, something that pulled their consciousness away from their wine glasses and business conversations toward the young woman at the piano, who was creating something beautiful from nothing but her own hands and heart. Elena lost herself in the music as she moved through the gentle cascades of notes that made Clair de Lune one of the most beloved pieces in the classical repertoire. Her technique wasn't perfect after years away from serious practice, but there was something in her playing that transcended technical precision. There was emotion, authenticity, a raw honesty that came from someone who had lived with music in her heart even when she couldn't express it. The ballroom had fallen completely silent except for the piano. Servers stopped moving through the room, standing still with their trays as they listened to the unexpected beauty flowing from the stage. Guests who had been checking their phones or having whispered conversations found themselves drawn into the spell that Elena was weaving, transported by music that seemed to speak directly to something vulnerable and forgotten in their carefully armored hearts. Richard Blackwell watched from his table with an expression that shifted from anticipation to confusion to something approaching alarm. This wasn't what he had planned. Elena was supposed to embarrass herself, to provide his guests with the cruel entertainment of watching someone fail publicly. Instead, she was creating something genuinely moving, something that was making his guests lean forward in their chairs with expressions of wonder rather than amusement. Elena finished Clair de Lune with the same gentle touch with which she had begun it, letting the final notes fade into silence that felt sacred rather than empty. For a moment, no one moved. The ballroom held its breath as if afraid to break the spell that had been cast over the evening. Then someone began to clap. Not the polite, obligatory applause that wealthy people offered to professional entertainers, but genuine appreciation that started with one person and spread through the room like wildfire. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding with an enthusiasm that surprised even Elena, who had been so focused on the music that she had forgotten about the audience watching her. Elena looked up from the piano keys to see faces that had been transformed by what they had just experienced. These people who lived surrounded by luxury and entertainment, who had access to the finest concerts and performances money could buy, were applauding her simple offering with genuine enthusiasm. She saw tears in some eyes, smiles of pure pleasure on faces that had looked skeptical when she first approached the stage. But Elena wasn't finished. She had prepared more than one piece, knowing that 15 minutes of music required more than a single composition. Without waiting for the applause to fade completely, she transitioned into her second selection, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that would allow her to showcase a different aspect of her musical personality. Where Debussy had been impressionistic and flowing, Chopin was romantic and emotionally direct. The Nocturne began with a melody so beautiful it seemed to bypass the mind entirely and speak directly to the heart. Elena's right hand sang the melody, while her left hand provided a gentle accompaniment that supported and enhanced the emotional content of the piece, without overwhelming it. As she played, Elena felt something happening that she hadn't experienced in years. She was losing herself in the music, forgetting about the audience, forgetting about Richard's cruel intentions, forgetting about her fear and anxiety. She was becoming pure expression, a conduit through which the composer's emotions could flow into the world and touch the hearts of everyone listening. The Chopin piece allowed Elena to demonstrate more of her technical abilities, while still maintaining the emotional authenticity that had made her first selection so powerful. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence across the keys, finding passages and phrases that she remembered loving when she had first learned this piece as a young student in Mexico City. But more than technique, Elena brought to the music the depth of someone who had lived through loss and sacrifice, someone who understood the bittersweet nature of beautiful things that couldn't last forever. Her playing had a maturity that came not from years of professional performance, but from years of real experience, real struggle, real understanding of what it meant to love something deeply enough to give it up for someone else's well-being. In the audience, people were having experiences they hadn't expected when they dressed in their finest clothes and drove to the Blackwell mansion for what they thought would be a typical charity gala. They were being reminded of parts of themselves they had forgotten in the pursuit of success and status. They were feeling emotions that their carefully controlled lives rarely allowed them to access. Dr. Patricia Chen, a renowned music critic who had been invited to the gala because of her husband's position as a federal judge, found herself leaning forward in her chair with complete focus. She had attended thousands of concerts and recitals, had heard the world's finest pianists perform in the most prestigious venues, but there was something about Elena's playing that cut through all the professional polish and technical perfection to touch something raw and real.
At another table, Marcus Westfield, a tech entrepreneur worth hundreds of millions of dollars, felt tears forming in his eyes as Elena moved through the most beautiful passage of the Chopin Nocturne. He couldn't remember the last time music had affected him so deeply, couldn't remember the last time he had felt anything that wasn't related to business deals or financial returns. Elena finished the Chopin piece and immediately moved into her final selection, Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. She had chosen this piece carefully, knowing that it would demonstrate yet another aspect of her musical abilities while providing a perfect conclusion to her impromptu recital. Bach required a different kind of playing than Debussy or Chopin. Where the Romantic composers emphasized emotion and expression, Bach demanded clarity, precision, and an understanding of mathematical beauty. Elena's fingers moved through the intricate patterns that Bach had woven into his prelude, each note perfectly placed and perfectly timed, creating music that was both intellectually satisfying and emotionally moving. The Bach prelude was like watching a master architect construct a cathedral out of sound, each phrase building upon the previous one, each voice in the complex texture contributing to a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. Elena played with a clarity that made every note audible while maintaining the forward momentum that kept the piece alive and breathing. As she approached the final measures of the prelude, Elena realized that something had fundamentally changed during these 15 minutes at the piano. She had rediscovered not just her ability to play music, but her identity as a musician. For 4 years she had thought of herself as someone who used to play piano, someone whose musical life was in the past. Now she understood that music wasn't something she had done, it was something she was. The final chord of the Bach prelude rang out clear and strong, and Elena lifted her hands from the keys with a sense of completion that went far beyond finishing a performance. She had completed a journey back to herself, a rediscovery of the part of her identity that she had thought was lost forever. The silence that followed was different from the silence after her first piece. This was the silence of people who had just experienced something extraordinary, something that had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. It was the silence of revelation, of recognition, of hearts that had been touched by something genuine in a world that often felt artificial and performative. Then the applause began, and it was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. The entire ballroom erupted in appreciation that was both overwhelming and deeply moving. People weren't just clapping, they were standing, cheering, expressing enthusiasm that went far beyond polite social obligation. Elena stood at the piano, overwhelmed by the response, struggling to process what had just happened. She had expected, at best, to survive the evening without humiliating herself. Instead, she had given a performance that had genuinely moved people, that had reminded them of the power of authentic artistic expression. Dr. Chen was the first to approach the stage, moving quickly through the crowd with the determination of someone who had just discovered something remarkable. "That was absolutely extraordinary," she said as Elena stepped down from the stage. "Your interpretation of the Chopin was particularly moving. Where did you study? Who was your teacher? Before Elena could answer, other people began gathering around her. Marcus Westfield appeared at her side, his eyes still bright with emotion. "I haven't been moved by music like that in years," he said. "You have genuine talent, not just technical ability but real musical intelligence." A woman Elena didn't recognize introduced herself as Sandra Morrison, director of the Los Angeles Chamber Music Society. "We're always looking for artists who can connect with audiences the way you just did. Would you be interested in discussing performance opportunities?" Elena felt dizzy from the sudden attention, the rapid shift from invisible house cleaner to celebrated performer. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she began. "I'm not a professional musician. I work here, in Mr. Blackwell's house. I clean and maintain the property." The group around her fell silent for a moment, processing this information. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. "You work here as household staff?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of incredulity. "Yes," Elena said simply. "I've been Mr. Blackwell's housekeeper for 4 years. Sandra Morrison looked confused and slightly angry. "Are you telling me that someone with your level of musical ability has been working as a housekeeper? That's absolutely criminal. You should be performing professionally, recording, touring. Your talent is being completely wasted." Elena glanced across the room toward Richard Blackwell, who was watching this interaction with an expression that had moved from confusion to anger. She could see that this wasn't how he had expected the evening to unfold, that her success was threatening his carefully constructed narrative about her place in his world. "It's complicated," Elena said quietly. "I have family responsibilities that require steady income and reliable health insurance. Music is beautiful, but it's not always practical." Dr. Chen shook her head emphatically. "But talent like yours is rare. You can't just waste it maintaining someone else's house when you could be creating beauty that touches thousands of people's lives." More people were joining the conversation now, drawn by the excitement and the unusual nature of discovering serious musical talent in such an unexpected context. Elena found herself surrounded by some of the most influential people in Los Angeles, all of them expressing amazement at her abilities and concern about her current situation. James Liu, a classical music promoter who had built his career on discovering and developing new talent, pushed through the crowd to reach Elena. "I've been in this business for 25 years, he said, "and I know genuine artistry when I hear it. What you just did up there wasn't just good playing, it was authentic musical communication. You made everyone in this room feel something real." Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her, all of them looking at her with respect and admiration that she had never experienced from wealthy people before. For 4 years, she had been invisible to people like this, someone who cleaned up after their parties and maintained their comfort while remaining beneath their notice. Now they were treating her as an equal, as someone whose abilities commanded their attention and respect. But even as she felt moved by their recognition, Elena was acutely aware that her situation hadn't actually changed. She was still Richard Blackwell's employee, still dependent on his goodwill for her job and her family's financial stability. She could see him across the room, his face growing darker with each passing moment as the attention and praise being lavished on Elena continued to grow. Victoria Blackwell appeared at Elena's side, her expression a mixture of confusion and barely concealed irritation. "Elena, I think you should return to your duties now. The guests need their dinner service to continue properly." The group around Elena turned to look at Victoria with expressions that ranged from surprise to outright disapproval. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. "Mrs. Blackwell, surely you understand that we're having an important conversation with a remarkably talented artist." "Artist?" Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Elena is our housekeeper. She cleans toilets and vacuums carpets. I don't know what she's told you, but she's not an artist. She's hired help." The silence that followed Victoria's words was uncomfortable and charged with tension. Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, not because she was ashamed of her work, but because Victoria's tone made it clear that she considered Elena's value as a human being to be defined entirely by her employment status. Sandra Morrison was the first to respond, and her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being respected. "Mrs. Blackwell, what Elena does for employment doesn't change the fact that she just gave one of the most moving musical performances I've heard in years. Talent doesn't recognize social boundaries, and artistic ability certainly isn't determined by someone's job title." Marcus Westfield nodded in agreement. "I've attended concerts at Carnegie Hall and the Metropolitan Opera, and I can honestly say that Elena's performance tonight was more emotionally affecting than most of what I've heard from supposedly world-class artists." Victoria looked around at the group surrounding Elena, clearly frustrated by their refusal to accept her characterization of the situation. "You people don't understand. Elena has responsibilities here. She has work to do. This little musical interlude was entertaining, but it's time for her to get back to reality." Elena felt caught between two worlds, between the recognition and respect being offered by these influential strangers and the harsh reality of her actual circumstances.
She appreciated their support more than she could express, but she also understood that Victoria was right about one thing. Elena did have responsibilities, both to her employer and to her family, that couldn't be dismissed simply because she had played piano successfully. "Mrs. Blackwell is right," Elena said quietly. "I do have work to finish tonight, and I don't want to interfere with your dinner any longer." "Wait," Dr. Chen said, pulling out her phone. "Before you go anywhere, I want your contact information. I meant what I said about your talent being extraordinary. There are opportunities in this city for someone with your abilities, and I want to help you explore them." Elena hesitated, glancing toward Richard Blackwell, who had begun moving across the room toward the group surrounding her. His expression made it clear that he was not pleased with how the evening was unfolding, and Elena knew that accepting contact information from his guests might be seen as overstepping the boundaries he had established for her role in his household. But Sandra Morrison was already holding out her business card. "Please take this. Call me tomorrow. What we heard tonight was special, and I want to discuss how we can help you share your gift with larger audiences." James Liu nodded enthusiastically. "I agree completely. Elena, you have the kind of natural musicality that can't be taught. It would be a tragedy if you didn't pursue opportunities to develop and share your talent." Elena took the business cards being offered to her, her hands trembling slightly as she realized what was happening. These people weren't just being polite or patronizing. They genuinely believed in her abilities and wanted to help her explore possibilities she had never dared to consider. Richard Blackwell finally reached the group, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed Elena's little performance. She's been very dedicated to preparing something special for you tonight." His tone was carefully controlled, but Elena could hear the anger underneath his polite words. She could see that he was furious about the way the evening had unfolded, about the fact that his attempt to humiliate her had backfired so completely. Dr. Chen turned to Richard with an expression of barely concealed disapproval. "Mr. Blackwell, I hope you realize what an extraordinary employee you have. Elena's musical abilities are truly remarkable."
She should be performing professionally, not cleaning houses. Richard's smile was cold and sharp. Elena has a job here that provides her with steady income and excellent benefits. Music is a lovely hobby, but it's not a reliable way to support oneself or one's family. I'm sure she appreciates your compliments, but reality is reality. Marcus Westfield stepped closer to Richard, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "With respect, Mr. Blackwell, what we heard tonight wasn't a hobby, that was professional-level artistry. Elena's talent is being wasted in her current position." Elena could see the tension building between Richard and his guests, could see that her unexpected success was creating a conflict she had never intended. She had simply tried to survive the evening without embarrassing herself, but now she found herself at the center of a confrontation between her employer and some of the most powerful people in the city. "I think perhaps we should let Elena return to her duties," Richard said firmly. "The evening is still young, and there are many responsibilities that require her attention." But Sandra Morrison wasn't finished. "Actually, Mr. Blackwell, I was hoping to schedule a time to speak with Elena privately about some opportunities that might interest her. Would it be possible for her to call me tomorrow?" Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Elena's schedule is quite full with her regular responsibilities. I'm not sure when she would have time for outside meetings." Elena felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She was standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice between the safety of her current situation and the possibility of something she had never dared to dream might be available to her again. The business cards in her hand felt like doorways to worlds she thought had been closed to her forever. But she was also acutely aware that Richard Blackwell held her livelihood in his hands, that her family's financial stability depended on her continued employment in his household. One word from him could destroy not just her own future, but her sister's education and her mother's medical care. "Thank you all so much for your kind words," Elena said carefully. "This has been the most amazing evening of my life. I need to think about everything you've said, and I promise I will consider all the opportunities you've mentioned." Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "That's all we can ask. But please don't wait too long. Talent like yours deserves to be shared with the world." As the group began to disperse and return to their tables, Elena felt Richard's hand on her arm, his grip firm enough to make his displeasure clear without being obvious to the other guests. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that only she could hear, "we need to have a conversation about this evening's events. Meet me in my study in 30 minutes. Elena nodded, her heart sinking as she realized that her moment of triumph was about to be followed by a reckoning she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. She had tasted possibility, had been offered opportunities she had never imagined, but now she would have to confront the reality of her situation and the power that Richard Blackwell held over her life. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of activity as Elena helped coordinate the continuation of the dinner service, clearing plates and ensuring that the evening proceeded smoothly for the guests who were still discussing her performance with enthusiasm and admiration. She could hear fragments of conversation as she moved through the ballroom, people talking about her talent, her story, the unexpected discovery they had made. But underneath her awareness of their continued praise, Elena felt a growing sense of dread about the confrontation that awaited her in Richard's study. She knew him well enough to understand that he would not tolerate having his authority challenged or his plans disrupted, even inadvertently. When 30 minutes had passed, Elena made her way to Richard's study with the same sense of walking toward an execution that she had felt earlier when approaching the piano. But this time there would be no music to save her, no beauty to transform the moment into something transcendent. Richard was waiting for her behind his massive desk, his face a mask of cold fury that he no longer needed to hide behind the polite facade he maintained for his guests. The Steinway piano sat in the corner of the room, beautiful and silent, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. "Sit down, Elena," Richard said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that was more frightening than shouting. Elena sat in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, her head held high despite her fear. Whatever Richard planned to do to her, she would face it with the dignity that no employer could take away from her. "That was quite a performance tonight," Richard began, and Elena could hear the venom underlying his seemingly neutral words. "Very different from what we discussed. I played the best music I could play," Elena replied quietly. "I tried to give your guests something beautiful." Richard's eyes were cold as winter. "What you gave my guests was the wrong impression. They now think you're some kind of undiscovered artist instead of what you actually are, which is my employee." Elena felt a spark of anger kindling in her chest. "I am your employee, Mr. Blackwell, but that doesn't mean I'm not also other things. Music is part of who I am, whether I work for you or not." "Music," Richard said, standing up and walking around his desk to loom over her, "is a luxury for people who can afford luxuries. You are here to work, not to entertain fantasies about artistic careers that will never happen." Elena looked up at him, seeing clearly for the first time the kind of man she had been working for all these years. "Why did you ask me to perform tonight, Mr. Blackwell? What did you really want to happen?" Richard smiled, and it was the coldest expression Elena had ever seen. "I wanted my guests to be entertained by watching someone embarrass themselves. I wanted them to see what happens when people try to reach above their station. Instead, you've given them ideas about your value that are completely unrealistic." The honesty of his cruelty was breathtaking. Elena had suspected his motivations, but hearing him state them so clearly was like being slapped. "You wanted me to fail," she said softly. "I expected you to fail," Richard corrected. "People like you don't succeed in worlds like this. But somehow you managed to fool my guests into thinking you're something special, and now I have to deal with the consequences of their misplaced sympathy." Elena stood up slowly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "The only thing I fooled anyone about tonight was letting them think I was happy working for someone who would deliberately try to humiliate me for entertainment." Richard's eyes flashed with anger. "You work for me because you need this job. Your family depends on the money you make here, and jobs like this aren't easy to find for someone with your limited qualifications and questionable legal status." The threat was clear and devastating. Richard was reminding her that he held not just her employment, but her entire family's welfare in his hands, that her immigration status made her vulnerable in ways that went far beyond simple job security. But Elena found that instead of feeling crushed by his threats, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years when dealing with Richard Blackwell. She felt strong. "You're right," she said calmly. "I do need this job, and my family does depend on the money I earn here. But tonight I discovered something I had forgotten about myself, and I don't think I can go back to pretending it doesn't exist." Richard moved closer to her, using his height and presence to intimidate her. "You don't have a choice about what you pretend, Elena. You work for me, and you'll do exactly what I tell you to do. If I hear that you've contacted any of those people from tonight, if I discover that you're pursuing any of these ridiculous musical fantasies, you'll find yourself unemployed and unemployable." Elena looked directly into his cold blue eyes and made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life forever. "Mr. Blackwell," she said with a clarity that surprised even her, "I quit." The words hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. Richard's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to disbelief to pure rage, as he processed what Elena had just said. For 4 years, no employee had ever dared to challenge him so directly, let alone quit on the spot during one of his social events. "You quit," Richard repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You think you can just walk away from this job because a few rich people complimented your little piano recital?" Elena felt a strange calm settling over her, the peace that comes from finally making a decision that has been building for years. "I think I can walk away from a job where my employer deliberately tries to humiliate me for his own entertainment. I think I deserve better than working for someone who sees my potential failure as amusing."
Richard moved closer, his intimidation tactics shifting into overdrive. "You're an undocumented immigrant with a high school education and a family that depends on every dollar you send home. Do you really think those people tonight were offering you anything real?" Elena's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I guess I'm about to find out." "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Richard said, his voice filled with cold fury. "When you're unemployed and desperate in a few weeks, don't come crawling back here expecting sympathy. I don't give second chances to people who betray my generosity." Elena almost laughed at his description of their employment relationship as generosity. 4 years of working for below-market wages, no paid time off, and constant fear of being fired for minor infractions hardly qualified as generous. But she had learned long ago that arguing with Richard about his perception of reality was pointless. "I'll collect my things and be gone within the hour," Elena said, turning toward the door. "You'll be gone in 15 minutes, Richard snapped. "Security will escort you out, and if you're found on this property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Elena paused at the door, looking back at the man who had controlled her life for 4 years. "Mr. Blackwell, those people tonight didn't see me as your employee or your entertainment. They saw me as a human being with value beyond what I could do for them. That's something you'll never understand." She left his study and walked through the mansion one last time, gathering her few personal belongings from the staff areas where she had spent so many hours cleaning and organizing. The party was still in full swing in the ballroom, and she could hear laughter and conversation as the wealthy guests continued their evening, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded in Richard's private study. Elena's hands shook as she packed her small bag with the uniform shirts she had laundered at home, the comfortable shoes that had carried her through countless hours of work, and the photo of her family that she kept in her locker. Everything she owned at the Blackwell mansion fit into a single canvas bag, a reminder of how little security she actually had in this job she had just abandoned. Victoria Blackwell appeared in the staff corridor as Elena was preparing to leave, her expression a mixture of confusion and disdain.
"Elena, what's this nonsense about you quitting? Richard says you've lost your mind over some silly compliments from his guests." Elena looked at Victoria, seeing clearly for the first time the emptiness behind the woman's expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair. Victoria had everything money could buy, but she had never created anything beautiful, never touched anyone's heart the way Elena had touched the hearts of the guests tonight. "Mrs. Blackwell, I've realized that I have talents that are worth more than this job pays, in every sense of the word worth. I'm going to see if I can build a life around those talents instead of hiding them." Victoria's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Talents? Elena, you're a housekeeper. Playing piano at parties doesn't qualify as talent. It's a trick, like a dog walking on its hind legs. Amusing for a moment, but not something you can build a life on." Elena felt sorry for Victoria in that moment, sorry for someone who could witness genuine artistry and dismiss it so completely. "I hope someday you experience something that makes you understand what real beauty feels like, Mrs. Blackwell. I hope you find something in your life that brings you the joy that music brings me." She walked past Victoria toward the service entrance, her bag slung over her shoulder and her head held high. Behind her she could hear Victoria calling after her, something about responsibility and ingratitude, but Elena didn't turn around. She was walking toward something new, even though she had no idea what that something might be. The security guard who had been summoned to escort her out was Miguel Santos, a kind man in his 50s who had always treated Elena with respect during her years at the mansion. His expression was apologetic as he walked beside her toward the gate. "Elena, I'm sorry about this," he said quietly. "I heard what happened tonight about your performance. Everyone's talking about how incredible you were." Elena smiled at him, one of the few genuine smiles she had managed in the past hour. "Thank you, Miguel. That means a lot to me. What are you going to do now?" he asked as they reached the main gate. Elena looked back at the mansion, its windows glowing with warm light as the party continued inside. "I'm going to try to become the person I was supposed to be before I got scared and settled for less." Miguel opened the gate for her, and Elena stepped through it into the cool night air. She had no car, no immediate prospects, and no safety net beyond the business cards in her pocket and the memory of applause still ringing in her ears. But for the first time in 4 years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. The taxi ride back to her small apartment in East LA gave Elena time to think about what she had just done. The practical part of her mind was already calculating how long her savings would last, how she would explain to her family that she had quit the job they all depended on, how she would pay next month's rent and continue sending money home for her sister's education and her mother's medical care. But the part of her that had just rediscovered itself at the piano was filled with an energy she hadn't felt in years. She pulled out the business cards she had been given and studied them in the dim light of the taxi's interior. Dr. Patricia Chen, Marcus Westfield, Sandra Morrison, James Liu. These were people who had seen something in her performance that went beyond polite appreciation. They had recognized genuine artistry and offered to help her develop it. Elena's apartment looked smaller and shabbier than usual when she returned that night, the contrast with the Blackwell mansion more stark after spending the evening in such opulent surroundings. But it was hers, paid for with her own work, and tonight it felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. She sat at her small kitchen table and called her sister Maria in Guadalajara, knowing that the time difference meant Maria would still be awake, probably studying for her business classes at the university. "Elena," Maria's voice was bright with excitement. "I was just thinking about you. How was the party tonight? Did you get to see any famous people?" Elena had planned to ease into the conversation, to prepare Maria gradually for the news about her job, but the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. "Maria, I quit my job tonight." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for several seconds before Maria spoke again. "You quit? Elena, what happened? Is everything okay?" Elena found herself crying as she told Maria the whole story, from Richard's cruel plan to her unexpected triumph, to the confrontation in his study that had ended with her walking away from 4 years of steady employment. Maria listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of encouragement or dismay. "Elena," Maria said when the story was finished, "I'm so proud of you." Elena wiped her eyes, surprised by her sister's response. "Proud of me? Maria, I just threw away the job that pays for your school and Mama's medicine. I have no idea how I'm going to support the family now." "You stood up for yourself," Maria said firmly. "For 4 years I've listened to you tell me about this horrible man who treats you like garbage, and tonight you finally said no. That takes courage." Elena felt a fresh wave of tears, but these were different from the tears of fear and uncertainty she had been crying. These were tears of relief, of being understood and supported by the person whose opinion mattered most to her. "But what about school?" Elena asked. "What about Mama's treatments?" "Elena, listen to me," Maria said, her voice carrying a maturity that reminded Elena how much her little sister had grown up during these years of struggle. "I'm graduating in 6 months. I already have a job lined up with an accounting firm in Mexico City. I can start helping with Mama's medical bills. And Mama's been doing much better lately. The new treatments are working, and she's been talking about maybe going back to work part-time." Elena felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. For 4 years she had seen herself as the only thing standing between her family and financial disaster. But her family had been growing and changing while she wasn't looking, becoming stronger and more self-sufficient. "What I'm saying," Maria continued, "is that maybe it's time for you to think about what you want instead of just what we need. Those people tonight, they saw something special in you. Maybe you should find out what that could mean." After they hung up, Elena sat in her quiet apartment thinking about her sister's words. She pulled out the business cards again and arranged them on her table like tarot cards that might reveal her future. Each one represented a possibility she had never dared to consider, a doorway to a world she thought had been closed to her forever. She decided to start with Dr. Patricia Chen, the music critic who had seemed most knowledgeable about the classical music world. Elena crafted a careful email, explaining her situation and asking if Dr. Chen would be willing to meet for coffee to discuss the opportunities she had mentioned. The response came within an hour, even though it was nearly midnight. Dr. Chen wrote that she had been hoping to hear from Elena and would be delighted to meet the next afternoon at a cafe near the UCLA campus. She included a phone number and a message that made Elena's heart race with possibility. "I've been thinking about your performance all evening. You have something that can't be taught, and I'd like to help you figure out how to share it with the world." Elena barely slept that night, her mind racing between excitement about the possibilities ahead and terror about the practical realities of her situation. She had enough savings to last about 6 weeks if she was careful, longer if she found some kind of part-time work to supplement her income. But 6 weeks felt like both an eternity and an instant when she thought about everything that would need to happen to build a new life around music. The next morning, Elena woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She dressed carefully in her best non-work clothes, a simple blue dress that she usually wore to church, and took the bus to UCLA to meet Dr. Chen. The cafe Dr. Chen had suggested was a small, artistic place near the music building, filled with students and faculty from the university's renowned music program. Elena felt intimidated being surrounded by so many people who moved through the world of music as naturally as she moved through the world of cleaning supplies and work schedules. Dr. Chen arrived exactly on time, an elegant woman in her 50s who radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in the company of world-class musicians. She greeted Elena warmly and ordered coffee for both of them before settling into a corner table where they could talk privately. "Elena," Dr. Chen began,
I want to start by saying that in 30 years of attending concerts and recitals, I rarely hear performances that affect me the way yours did last night. You have a gift that goes beyond technical training. Elena felt her cheeks warm with the compliment. Thank you, Dr. Chen. That means more to me than you can know. Call me Patricia, Dr. Chen said with a smile. Now I want to understand your situation better. You mentioned that you studied at the Mexico City Conservatory. What level of training did you complete? Elena explained her background, from her early lessons as a child through her acceptance to the conservatory and the family crisis that had ended her formal musical education. Patricia listened intently, occasionally asking questions about her teachers, her repertoire, and her goals during those early years. So you had significant classical training, but you've been away from serious practice for 4 years, Patricia summarized. And yet last night you played with the kind of musical maturity that usually takes decades to develop. That suggests that your time away from music wasn't wasted time. It was life experience that informed your artistry. Elena had never thought about her years of struggle in those terms before. I suppose going through difficult times does change how you understand emotion in music. Exactly, Patricia said, leaning forward with enthusiasm. What I heard last night wasn't just good technique, it was storytelling. You were communicating something real about the human experience through those pieces. That's what separates true artists from people who just play notes correctly.
Patricia pulled out a small notebook and began writing as she talked. I think there are several paths we should explore for you. First, you need to get back into serious practice. I know a wonderful teacher, Professor Catherine Williams at UCLA, who specializes in working with adult students who are returning to music after time away. Elena's heart sank slightly at the mention of lessons and teachers. Patricia, I should be honest about my financial situation. I quit my job last night, and I don't have the resources for expensive music lessons or programs. Patricia waved away her concern. Elena, talent like yours opens doors. Professor Williams owes me several favors, and I think she'd be willing to work with you in exchange for helping with her studio classes. There are also scholarship programs and grants available for adult students with exceptional abilities. She continued writing in her notebook, creating what looked like a comprehensive plan. Second, you need performance opportunities. I think Sandra Morrison was serious about her offer. The Chamber Music Society regularly features emerging artists, and their audiences appreciate discovering new talent. Elena felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Patricia was suggesting. This all sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure I'm ready for professional performance opportunities. Last night was the first time I'd played for an audience in 4 years. Last night proved you're ready, Patricia said firmly. You don't need to be perfect, Elena. You need to be authentic. Audiences connect with authenticity much more than they connect with technical perfection. Patricia spent the next hour outlining a detailed plan for Elena's musical development. Voice lessons to improve her stage presence, master classes with visiting artists, competition opportunities that could provide both experience and financial support, networking events where she could meet other musicians and potential collaborators. The most important thing, Patricia said as their meeting drew to a close, is that you commit to this path completely. Half measures won't work in the music world. You need to decide that you're a professional musician, not someone who used to play piano. Elena left the cafe with a folder full of information, contact numbers and application forms. Her head was spinning with possibilities, but she also felt more focused than she had in years. For the first time since leaving Mexico, she had a clear sense of direction. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena threw herself into rebuilding her musical life with the same dedication she had once brought to maintaining the Blackwell mansion. She contacted Professor Williams and arranged to audit several classes in exchange for helping with studio maintenance. She reached out to Sandra Morrison and scheduled an audition for the Chamber Music Society's Emerging Artist program. Most importantly, she began practicing with the intensity of someone preparing for the most important performance of her life. She rented practice time at a local music school, spending 4 to 6 hours a day reacquainting herself with repertoire she had loved and learning new pieces that would showcase her abilities. The work was physically and emotionally demanding. Her fingers cramped from the sudden increase in activity. Her shoulders ached from hours at the piano bench. But with each passing day, Elena could feel her musical abilities returning and strengthening, like a muscle that had been dormant but not destroyed. 3 weeks after quitting her job at the Blackwell mansion, Elena received a call that would change everything. James Liu, the classical music promoter she had met at Richard's gala, had been working behind the scenes to create an opportunity for her. Elena, he said, his voice filled with excitement, I have a proposition that I think will interest you. The Los Angeles Philharmonic is looking for a soloist for their community outreach concert series. These are smaller venues, more intimate settings, but they pay well and the exposure is incredible. Elena felt her heart racing. The Los Angeles Philharmonic was one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world. The idea of performing with them seemed impossible. "I've submitted a recording of your performance from the Blackwell Gala," James continued. "Someone recorded it on their phone and sent it to me. The quality isn't perfect, but your playing comes through clearly. The orchestra's artistic director wants to meet with you next week." Elena sat down heavily in her apartment's single chair, overwhelmed by how quickly her life was changing. 3 weeks ago she had been invisible, cleaning someone else's house and believing her musical dreams were buried forever. Now she was being considered for a performance with one of the world's great orchestras. "James," she said quietly, "I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like this. I'm just getting back into serious practice." "Elena," James said firmly, "I've been in this business long enough to recognize the real thing when I hear it. You have something that most professional musicians spend their entire careers trying to find. Don't let fear keep you from sharing that gift." The audition with the Los Angeles Philharmonic was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Elena spent the weekend in a state of controlled panic, practicing the pieces she had chosen until her neighbors began complaining about the noise. She prepared Bach's Goldberg Variations, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a range of repertoire that would demonstrate both her technical abilities and her musical interpretation. On Tuesday morning, Elena took the bus to Walt Disney Concert Hall, the stunning Frank Gehry-designed home of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The building's flowing metallic surfaces caught the morning light like a sculpture come to life, and Elena felt intimidated by its obvious importance and grandeur. Inside, the hall was even more impressive. The acoustics were perfect, and the stage seemed to float in a sea of warm wood and elegant lines. Elena had never performed in a space designed specifically for classical music, and the atmosphere was both inspiring and terrifying. The artistic director, Michael Chen, was a serious man in his 60s who had built his reputation through his work with emerging artists and his commitment to expanding classical music's reach beyond traditional audiences. He greeted Elena warmly but professionally, explaining that the community outreach series was designed to bring classical music to venues throughout Los Angeles that didn't usually host such performances. "We perform in schools, community centers, retirement homes, and other places where people might not otherwise have access to live classical music," he explained. "The audiences are diverse and often include people who have never heard a live classical performance. We need musicians who can connect with those audiences, who can make the music feel accessible and meaningful." Elena nodded, understanding that this was as much about her ability to communicate as it was about her technical skills. "I think I understand what you're looking for. Music should touch people's hearts, not just impress them." "Exactly," Michael said. "Now let's hear what you've prepared." Elena approached the concert grand piano at the center of the stage, her hands steady despite her nervousness. The instrument was magnificent, perfectly tuned and incredibly responsive. As she began the Bach Goldberg Variations, Elena felt the same transformation that had occurred at the Blackwell Gala. Her fear dissolved into focus, her nervousness into musical expression. She played for 20 minutes, moving through the 3 pieces she had prepared with growing confidence and emotional connection. The acoustics of the hall enhanced every nuance of her playing, and she could feel the music filling the space with beauty and meaning. When she finished, Michael Chen was smiling. "Elena, that was exactly what I was hoping to hear. You have technical skills, but more importantly, you have the ability to make music speak to people's hearts. I'd like to offer you a position in our community outreach series." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as the reality of what was happening sank in. She was being offered a professional position with one of the world's great orchestras, not as a charity case or a social experiment, but because her musical abilities had earned her the opportunity. "The position comes with a salary that should allow you to support yourself while you continue developing your career," Michael continued. "We perform about twice a month, and you'll also have access to our practice facilities and opportunities to work with our coaching staff." Elena accepted the position with gratitude that went far beyond words. As she left Walt Disney Concert Hall that afternoon, she realized that her life had been completely transformed in less than a month. She was no longer someone who used to play piano. She was a professional musician with a future that seemed to stretch out before her like an endless symphony. That evening, Elena called her family to share the news. Her mother cried with joy, telling Elena how proud she was and how she had always known that music would find its way back into her daughter's life. Maria shrieked with excitement and immediately began planning a trip to Los Angeles to hear Elena's first performance. But the call that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Miguel Santos, the security guard from the Blackwell mansion, had somehow gotten her phone number and called to congratulate her on her new position. "Elena," he said, "everyone's talking about what you've accomplished. You showed a lot of people that dignity and talent matter more than money and status. You gave hope to people who needed it." Elena realized that her story had spread beyond the wealthy guests at Richard's gala. She had become a symbol of something larger than her individual success, proof that dreams deferred are not necessarily dreams destroyed.
6 months later, Elena Rodriguez stood on the stage of a high school auditorium in East LA, preparing to perform for an audience of students who looked like she had looked at their age, young people from immigrant families who worked hard and dreamed big, but rarely saw their dreams reflected in the world around them. As she began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece that had been part of her triumph at the Blackwell Gala, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost a job that had paid her bills but had crushed her spirit. She had found a career that fed her soul and allowed her to support her family while doing work that mattered. The teenagers in the audience listened with the same rapt attention that the wealthy guests had shown at Richard's party, proving that great music speaks to everyone regardless of their circumstances or background. When Elena finished playing, the applause was enthusiastic and genuine, filled with the recognition that they had just witnessed something special. After the performance, several students approached Elena to ask about her story, about how someone from a background like theirs could find a path into the world of classical music. Elena answered their questions honestly, telling them about the years of struggle and sacrifice, but also about the importance of never giving up on the parts of themselves that made them feel most alive. As Elena packed up her music and prepared to leave the school, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that terrifying night when Richard Blackwell had tried to humiliate her in front of his wealthy friends. His cruelty had inadvertently given her the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to rediscover who she was meant to be. She had learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the door that opens to your best life. She had learned that talent and dignity are more powerful than money and status. Most importantly, she had learned that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, as long as you have the courage to take the first step. Elena Rodriguez was no longer invisible. She was a musician, an artist, and an inspiration to everyone who heard her story. And every time she sat down at a piano, she was proving that dreams deferred are sometimes dreams that are simply waiting for their perfect moment to bloom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.